Welcome to the Midlands Air Museum. It's a great museum, and on the hottest day of the year, it's still insanely windy. It's not always windy here, but it seems to be every time I try and film. Anyway, we're here to look at a couple of special aircraft because this has a particular focus on Cold War era aircraft, and there's several examples here, so that's why we're starting here. And we're starting with this, the F-110. Now, I know that's going to cause a bunch of people to go screaming to the comments and call me an idiot. This is also known as the YF-110, and I'll explain why, but it's going to be a bit of a journey. So rather than going to the comments, you might want to hang around because you'll either learn something or you'll have a whole lot more reasons to go to the comments and tell me why I'm stupid. But anyway, this F-110, but also this is also an F-110. And the reason why is not because of an AI garbage slop script or because I've lost my marbles. It's actually because of the Department of Defense in the USA and a guy named Robert McNamara. So this is the F-110, but it is, as I know, it's an F-4 Phantom, and that one over there is a MiG-21. But the reason they have those names, we have to kind of skip back in history a little bit to explain fighter designations in the US Air Force. You see, right back in the 1950s and the very early 1960s, the newly formed United States Air Force decided to reorganise the designation system for their aircraft, in particular for interceptors and aerial superiority aircraft. Until that point, the P for pursuit designation had been used, which is how we have aircraft like the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-51 Mustang and so on. Now, at the time, they managed to muddy up the waters further by counting air-to-air missiles as unmanned fighter aircraft. So the designation for F-98 was the Falcon missile that was ultimately redesignated as the AIM-4 Falcon. However, big things were on the way for the USAF, and they had the first of a new breed of supersonic aircraft that just by pure chance happened to start with the F-100 designation for the F-100 Super Sabre. Though initially it was the YF-100, the Y means it's a proven concept that's in the field testing phase. If it's an X, it means it's still in the concept testing phase. Still with me? Good. Okay, well this is the F-100 Super Sabre, known for its dancing, and not in a good way, and it's the first of the Century series. So let's look at some of the others. This big lad is the F-101 Voodoo, and he had some crazy ideas about nuclear-tipped air-to-air missiles. And also this is actually the F-101B, but we'll get back to that and why that's an issue later. Then there was the F-102 Delta Dagger, and the XF-103 that never survived the concept phase, though did reappear briefly as the XF-108 testbed, but again was cancelled. Had it been built, it would have been incredible, but also insanely expensive. The entire aircraft was made of titanium. This is the F-104 Death Stick. Yes, it is. Get over it. Then there's the F-105 Thunder Chief, which deserves a video all of itself. It's quite the plane. The F-106 Delta Dart, which was the Delta Dagger's older, meaner big brother, and also the fastest single-engine jet aircraft ever made. And then it gets murky. The F-107 is an F-100 with so many mods the Air Force designated it to a new name. So why not the YF or XF-107? Well, because it was a modification of an already designated fighter, the USAF decided to skip those designations and ordered a production run of 9 airframes designated the F-107A, which it then reduced to just 3. Either way, it was dropped in favour of the Thunder Chief. Keeping things murky, the next one was the XF-108 Rapier. Again, never made it further than a wooden mock-up. And the F-109 is even more messy. Originally, this was going to be assigned to a 2-seater interceptor version of the Voodoo. It was in fact this aforementioned big lad here, but instead they went with F-101B, which is why this is an F-101B and not that designation. Instead, Bell got to take hold of that designation, and then they did something else with it. You see, Bell temporarily used the designation XF-109 for its proposed VTOL concept, which was pretty much cancelled at conception. Think of it as a V-22 Osprey, but in fighter jet format and using jet engines. And that's where we find ourselves back at this thing, the F-110 Spectre. Or at least that's what the Air Force called it, because the Navy was calling it the F-4H-1, because the Navy had a completely different set of systems and numbering of aircraft to the way the USAF was doing it, and even to the way the Army was doing it. And that's when a certain gentleman lost his shit. And just for the record, in the Navy system, the F is for fighter, 4 denotes it as being the 4th airframe type adopted from a specific company, H to denote the McDonnell company, D was used for Douglas, which at the time hadn't merged with McDonnell, and that was in 1967. Anyway, finally the 1 denotes the block version. So it's fairly understandable that this guy, Defence Secretary Robert McNamara, utterly blew a gasket at all this nonsense and demanded all 3 bunches of the military consolidate their naming and numbering of aircraft. So this became the F4 Phantom II, and it was called that by everybody, and nobody was calling it the F110 anymore. They did add a letter on the end to tell you which block version it was. So for example, this is an F4C, and that tells you it's the version just before they put guns on them. It's the one that went to Vietnam without guns and turned out to be a little bit of an issue, but that's a whole nother story. So F4 Phantom C, known by that name by whoever was flying it, whether that was Navy or Air Force. And nobody was calling it the F110 anymore. So how was it that this thing became the F110A? Well, we'll get into that in a second, but just a quick little bit of admin, because I can already hear the scuttling of angry feet run into the comments to hammer in their disapproval. I should mention that only aircraft that actually went into production count as Century Series aircraft. So an F100 is a Century Series aircraft, but an F103, because it never actually made it into production, is not a Century Series aircraft. So not everything that has a 100 plus designation is Century Series, but just for the sake of kind of filling in the blanks so you wonder why there's certain blanks in the numbering, that's why I went through all of them. Also, the F111, that's worth mentioning as well. That was the last of the Century Series, and the reason it had an F designation is that initially one of the roles it was intended to be was an interceptor and not just a bomber. And there is some argument, as with the F117 that we'll get to later, that it was given the F designation because it would appeal to some of the more top-end pilots who were after a fighter posting and didn't want to be bomber boys. Anyway, because the F111 was already given its designation before McNamara lost his shit and was only to be used by the USAF, it got to keep its Century Series status, and it's the last one in the series. There you go, that's the Century Series. Now let's get into why this has a Century Series designation. The USAF found itself with a slight dilemma. It had started to, well, acquire aircraft that certain people would be very annoyed to find out it had acquired. Things like MiGs. They were very keen to test fly these things and work out their capabilities and vulnerabilities and so on, but ideally without these previously mentioned annoyed people finding out. And the solution they came up with was this. They repurposed the YF-110A and the F-110 designations and assigned them to the captured MiG-21. And the reason they did that was because they figured that if it was referred to in documents that were intercepted or communications or whatever else, and somehow it got into the wrong hands, without maybe the wider context of what was going on, it might get missed, and they might be that they assumed that what they were referring to was actually a development of the F4 Phantom or another prototype or whatever that was in that line. So the idea was to kind of try and hide it in plain sight. And this became a bit of a thing with the new Century designations. They were given to various acquired airframes until we get to this thing, where it all gets murky all over again. The F117 was given the F designation to try and hide it in plain sight. It was hoped that by giving it a fighter designation, despite it absolutely having zero game as a fighter and sticking with the Century Series numbers, the F-17 would be harder to pick out from intercepted communications and so on. And also, again, because apparently it's fairly easy to fool pilots, and it was thought that an F designation would make it more attractive to the top tier flyers who wouldn't realise it was just an attack or a strike aircraft. So it would be natural to assume that the YF-117 and the YF-117D were prototypes for the F-17. Well, no, the YF-117 was, but the YF-117D was a completely different aircraft. It was this. The Tacit Blue, a stealth aircraft, but an entirely different aircraft design and mission. So what the hell, Department of Defence? Well, the thinking was this time that the F-117 Nighthawk was a public domain aircraft, so if they used the YF-117 designation, then that might fool any spies who intercepted their communications and so on into thinking that it was just a block upgrade for the existing Nighthawk rather than a completely different aircraft with a whole different set of mission parameters in mind. So that's why they monkeyed around with those numbers. But as far as we know, the F-117 is the last to use that Century Series number sequence. So Currently no F118, but we'll see what happens. So now you know why I referred to this thing as a YF110A and not a MiG-21, which is what it actually is. And now you understand the whole mess of numbering and why the F117 Nighthawk has that designation and so on. And that's it. I'm not even going to get into why the F-22 skipped straight to the F-35. It's not worth it. They just did. And that's why I also need to go and sit in a dark room with a glass of water and some ice. Thanks for watching.